someone always keeping up with what is going on in the political world, it's always interested me on why some politicians go back on their promises and change their stance once they become elected to office and are in Congress. And since becoming more familiar with researching how Washington works since the 1970s, big business corporations and lobbying associates have flooded our capital and the most influential players in attempting to legally bribe our politicians, to push them to legislate for big businesses' favors. These people are called lobbyists. Their job is to persuade or legally bribe politicians to pass policies into law through their economic and social agendas, which is protected through a Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United versus Federal Elections and Commissions. There are definitely two sides to the issue, yet the power of lobbyists have been overused and have bought out politicians on both the right and left to a point where it has become the politicians' fault for allowing these actions to continue. There should be serious accountability by not just giving a voice to a highest bidder or most powerful company, yet by giving more access to a diverse combination of lobbyists of all incomes and agendas. Therefore, why have lobbying powers increased in Washington, and why aren't politicians on both sides sounding the alarm? The answer is quite simple. The phrase money can make you talk. In lobbying's instance, money can make you pass legislation. Today, I will be talking about the problem of corruption in Washington when it comes to lobbying politicians, what's the causes behind the issue of how these legal bribes are allowed to happen, and how can we solve this without completely restricting the lobbying community and putting the American people's voice and issues first. Corporations now spend about $2.6 billion a year on reported lobbying expenditures, more than $2 billion we spend to fund the House and Senate. Today, the biggest companies have upwards of 100 lobbyists representing them, allowing them to be everywhere all the time. Edward B. Logan, a political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania, says that for every dollar spent on lobbying for labor unions and public interest groups together, large corporations and their associates now spend $34. Of the 100 organizations that spend the most on lobbying, 95 consistently represent business. And where does this money go? It goes directly in the politicians' pockets in exchange for access to influence politicians' vote in Congress. Jimmy Williams, an MSNBC political contributor and former lobbyist for the alcohol and beverage industry, was in Washington lobbying for the 2003-2010. He claims during this time in lobbying, over the years, the work began to weigh on him. Every fundraiser was yet another legal bribe. Every committee hearing I'd look up and think, I just bought his vote. And every time I got a bill passed, or better yet killed, I would think to myself, that would have worked if I hadn't bought out the outcome. He got disgusted for how Washington worked, yet he admitted at first he had fun. Unlimited expense accounts, nights out on the town, expensive bottles of wines, elaborate meals with sitting senators and congresswomen and men. Yet when he looks back at it, he regrets it, because he claimed he was doing the bidding of the interests of the corporations over the interests of the American people. For example, when you vote a congressman or woman into office, you did that because of his or her message and policy proposals. Yet when legal bribes take place, where politicians are giving large amounts of money, the promises to you become second fiddle to the orders from big businesses. How this ultimately negatively affects the electorate is that business interests are first, and it makes you feel as if your vote was worth nothing if corporations are buying out politicians. Pete Buttigieg, a now famous politician whose presidential aspirations became to an end 2 months ago because of many factors, yet one of those was challenged at a Democratic debate was his stance on lobbying and big pharma donations. According to Kevin Robillard, a political editor at HuffPo, Pete Buttigieg was donated $19 million from big pharma, where other prominent Democrats attacked him on his stance, saying he was taking advice from the donors and lobbyists instead of the American people. Knowing that most Democratic voters are against big business influencing policymaking, Pete was put on notice. And because he attempted these funded, he turned on American interests and sided with big pharma, in essence being influenced by his donors to make a decision for him. This is just one example of big business influencing political decisions. There are many more on both sides of the aisle, Yet the point is that Americans don't want people they vote into office being paid vast amounts of money to vote a certain way when their message does not represent the people's decision. Now that I have gotten an idea about how much money and how widespread this issue is in American politics, now I will talk about what the causes are for the issues and why it happens. Harry Truman once said, "You can't get rich in politics unless you're a crook." Now the 1940s were a different time, where book deals and speeches were not as common for politicians. Yet I agree generally with Truman's rule, and because in some cases when politicians put themselves above the electorate, they are not working in the interest of the American people, yet being majorly influenced by money coming from lobbyists to vote in their favor. For example, according to Abby Mueller, a general practitioner at Gaslow, said, "These congressmen and women's culture of corruption, which continues a decades-long practice of political pandering to the pharmaceutical industries, carries a real cost. Americans spent $535 billion on prescription drugs in 2018, an increase of 50% since 2010. These price increases far surpass inflation, with Big Pharma increasing prices on its most prescribed medication by anywhere from 40 to 71% from 2011 and 2015. No politician from either the right or the left run on wanting to up your medical costs. You would lose in a heartbeat. So why do these numbers show a large increase in the price of drugs? Just take a look at the number of pharma spending lobbying for their causes. According to Murphy Hilberton from the Cornell University Press, leading voice in Big Pharma in 2018 spent nearly $30 million on lobbying to congressmen and women, which you can say has definitely not helped the causes of drug price reduction. Murphy is right when he says this isn't helping the American people. For example, Joseph Landy, a senior resident of Boca Raton, Florida, says, "I'm a retired police officer. My doctor prescribes Recitus for chronic dry eye. I expect to spend at least $1,000 this year for Recitus, and there is no cheaper generic. I have had to stop taking other drugs. I need to pay for this drug. How much do these drugs companies need to make on the backs of patients?" Just 5 years ago, Joseph spent half that cost at $500, which was much more affordable for a retired senior. Joseph argued why Congress can't get a hold of these drug prices and that something must be done because it has drained low-income and middle-income Americans. There are countless stories like this across the country, which makes this a serious issue for many Americans. Yet the issue has gotten worse, and the cause for this is big money in politics, where corporations have bought out politicians' consciousness. Now that I have talked about how these actions of taking money from lobbyists are hurting everyday Americans, because you are entitled to vote a certain way when someone is paying you, I will now talk about the possible solutions to this issue. That Washington is corrupted by a special interest is perhaps the most common critique of the federal government. Poll after poll reveals the public is convinced that lobbyists are a destructive influence, and most lobbying reforms ideas accordingly take a distantly moralizing tone. Drain the swamp was Donald Trump's lingo during the campaign, saying too many politicians were bought out. Nancy Pelosi's previously used that same line while rallying in 2006 to flip the House back to the Democrats and break the link between lobbyists and legislation. It's a lot of the same stuff, all talk, yet the prices for drugs and lobbying influence has only gone up. Again, the lobbyists are not to fully blame. Lobbying is their job. Politicians have an equal fault in this for taking these legal bribes. I think there is a proper, simple, and cost-effective solution to this issue. The Library of Congress should create a website that will become the online forum and cleaning house for all public policy advocacy. Such a website would both level the playing field, which is much cheaper to post a website than to hire an army of lobbyists to descend on Washington, and increase transparency and accountability, knowing all positions and arguments will be public, so everyone knows who is lobbying for what and why. This will result in more democratic and more thoroughly vetted public policy, so politicians can be held accountable on policy promises they have made, and that people will be more confident in our democracy. To conclude, after looking at the initial issues of lobbying in Congress, the cause of the issue and how it hurts everyday Americans, and the possible solutions to stop these problems from happening, it is clear that the American people deserve better than what they are witnessing right now. Whether your medical bills are too high or rent-seeking so corporations can have a boom on short-term success at the cost of the average Americans, it is clear we have a problem in Washington. No American should feel that the person they voted is going back on their words and being influenced with money by lobbyists and donors. Therefore, without solving the issue, there's no telling how much more power lobbyists will have over time, to what extent our democracy will be bought out. Thank you, Professor Raymond. Have a great summer.